Hello, everyone. Our next session is about to start. We're in the SDG Media Zone live from UNHQ. During the General Assembly, we have our friend Nyle Di Marco, disability advocate, best-selling author, producer, with us, together with the Assistant General for Human Rights. I leave it to you guys. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, good afternoon to everyone. My name is, again, Ilze Kehris. I'm the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. And this is the first day of the SDG Summit. So I'm very happy to be here at the SDG Media Zone, welcoming you all to this panel on disability and human rights. And I'm really happy, much happier even, that we have such a brilliant discussant with us, because we have a very important issue. And here we have the best-selling author, producer, actor, and advocate, Nyle Di Marco. Very much a pleasure and privilege for me. And of course, this is exactly what we need, someone who can talk directly and with the very convincing impact that you have on the barriers and breaking barriers and making sure that they're leaving no one behind really is meaningful. So just very quickly about Nyle. Nyle is a New York Times best-selling author. That is for his book, Deaf Utopia, a Memoir and a Love Letter to a Way of Life. He's a producer known for the critically acclaimed documents Deaf You and the Academy Award-nominated documentary short film Audible for Netflix. Last and certainly not least, he's an advocate and a real champion for not only the deaf community, but for the human rights of people and with disabilities worldwide. LGBTIQ plus rights and a lot of other things. So a very, very warm welcome to Nyle. I would like to start off with a question maybe. In your advocacy, because all of us are talking about inclusion, but then how do we actually do it? And in your advocacy, what are the lessons that you have learned in terms of promoting inclusion and promoting of human rights for persons with disabilities? And why do you think that that is important?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, obviously, when you look at how people with disabilities are portrayed specifically in the media and the deaf community, you see a lot of misunderstandings. You see a lot of misconceptions, certainly. I think disability is widely misunderstood. It's something that so many people don't understand, and certainly many people don't understand that there's a community involved with disability, right? Those assumptions have led us to a place where we have to work together to really build better relationships and build a better world. I think when we talk about inclusion, so much of it really boils down to education and really the importance of helping people understand that it's not just in America that we need to be educating, but it's around the world, right? We need to be educating about not only people with disabilities, but people who have disabilities that you might not see, right? Invisible things like deafness. I think it's very varied, and how we approach it also has to be very varied. I think in many ways we're just getting started, right, to really see change in the disability community. One thing that I do is, I go out and I present and I give talks about, what people with disabilities need, but one of the biggest things that I have to teach oftentimes is that it's not one size fits all, right? Just because I'm deaf doesn't mean that I can speak for other disabilities, and I think it's really important that everyone is given a platform in this conversation to have a seat at the table and make change.
Yes, I think that also is such a key point that we very often forget. We talk about disabilities as though we're talking about one group of people, but of course the diversity of people overall and individuals, but certainly also the very different aspects of disabilities is so essential, as you're saying. I wonder if you have any comments and are familiar with the processes at the UN, political processes, all of that is geared towards change that is happening here, and when it comes to disability inclusion, and what, if you have any comments about the possibility to participate and the access to those processes, and what do you think about that?
I have not been directly involved in much of what happens here at the UN. But I have, seen so much of the work that comes out of here, and I've read so much about it. The inclusion that we see is really incredible, especially when you look at the World Federation of the Deaf. I mean, the World Federation of the Deaf has a very big seat at the table in conversations with the UN. So while I haven't been directly involved, I have been able to see a lot of the work that goes on. And I do try to advocate and certainly promote those stories of, where we're seeing access here at the UN. I think it's really important that people understand that you can participate. And that you absolutely can be a part of these conversations, what they're talking about in terms of what the deaf community needs and deaf stories and getting those out there on a larger platform to the world, I think is really incredible. I personally think that the UN is doing amazing work. The roundtables that they've hosted of people with disabilities and, people from my own community to highlight their activism specifically surrounding language deprivation within the community. I mean, that's one of the biggest communities or one of the biggest issues impacting the deaf community. And I think the work that they've done so far couldn't have been any better, in all honesty.
Thank you. And we, from a human rights perspective, of course, stress the importance of having the norms and the standards at the basis to really provide for the rights. And there, of course, hopefully we have the member states on board to provide that framework. But for inclusivity and equal access to opportunities, could you also maybe tell us a little bit about the challenges and the barriers that people with disabilities continue to face, please?
Definitely. I think from my own perspective as a deaf person, I can share that my community faces quite a few. But I think the biggest barrier that we see is essentially the conversation around how we improve our lives, right? Oftentimes we want to work to improve the lives of deaf people, but I think a lot of people focus specifically on the ability to hear or not hear when we should be focusing on language deprivation. There are millions of kids worldwide who don't have access to education in a formal sign language. Statistically, in fact, only 2% of deaf kids out there have access to education in a formal sign language. So I come from a really incredible place of privilege with my education, but also a place where I'm able to advocate for better legislation that's going to support changes to that, right? That's going to support benchmarks that are going to help those children essentially find not only education, but find their ability to express themselves. And it goes back to the core of what I mentioned earlier with education. If we aren't seeing such a glaring issue as language deprivation is, front and center of the conversation, then it's really tough to talk about the other things that we need. We're really pushing heavily for legislation to provide benchmarks for kids between the ages of 0 and 5 to ensure that they have access and exposure to language. And it's one of the more specific things that I think people can get, involved in and can help support.
Well, thank you. You essentially already addressed what was going to be my last question, but just to give your last chance for a sentence, because I was going to ask, what would you give as an advice for something practical that we can do as individuals or as communities or even organizations in order to support the implementation of the human rights for persons with disabilities?
In my work, I do a lot of speaking with whether it's communities or colleges or corporations, but I do a lot of speaking events where I see a lot of conversations about diversity and equality and inclusion. And I think that kind of conversation is often uncomfortable. I think it scares a lot of people, and I think, to be honest with you, what we need to do is start with ourselves, right? I think we need to start changing our perspective and our hearts and our minds and how we see disability. I think that's really at the heart of the matter. And in order to improve anything, I think we really need to be able to see it clearly. The question really comes down to, I think, how we all do our part and how we all participate in helping people feel that they belong. I think it's really key that people, whether they're, arriving to a company or to a culture and are expected to fit the needs of the organization, also feel that the organization is there to fit their needs as well and really feel a sense of belonging. And, it's a challenge going forward for sure. We have a lot of work to do, I think.
Thank you. And the reminder to each and every one of us that, of course, is true. Human rights, the dignity and respect that we have to have for each other starts for each of us at home and with ourselves. So the challenge to each one of us. Thank you so much. We are learning from you and we'll continue to do so and happy to continue our engagement.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for having me. This was really great. This was incredible.